Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. Today we're speaking with Mr. Jeff Deist about political correctness. Mr. Deist is president of the Mises Institute and previously was a tax attorney specializing in mergers and acquisitions for private equity clients. He was chief of staff for Congressman Ron Paul during the 2012 election and was Dr. Paul's congressional press secretary from 2000 to 2006. You can follow his work at Mises.org. That's MISES.org. For more information, see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/PC. Jeff, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, gentlemen, for having me.
Okay, so let's just start off with some basic definitions. So what is political correctness and where did the term come from?
Well, that's a good question, especially the latter. There's some dispute as to how it originated. Some people have even said that the French philosopher Foucault used the term for the first time in the 1960s. He was using it to take umbrage at the liberal movement to sort of force us to have a certain political orthodoxy. I'm not sure if he's the first person to use it, but that's one of the ideas anyway. But from my perspective, the definition of PC is straightforward. PC is simply a manipulation of our thoughts and our language and our words to reach a certain desired political outcome. In other words, to shade meaning of what we say and what we write and ultimately what we think as a result. So it's nefarious in that sense, and it's really a form of propaganda, but it's a more modern form and it's more insidious form, and it's really something that's all around us, and oftentimes it's around us in ways we're not aware of. So PC is sort of public relations and propaganda, but for the 21st century.
Okay, so can you talk about some of the precursors to PC, like the Frankfurt School and Edward Bernays?
Well, Edward Bernays is a fascinating guy. A lot of Americans have not heard that name. He was born in the late 1800s, was the nephew of the infamous Sigmund Freud. So Edward Bernays came to America as a young guy, I think a very young guy, a child actually, and grew up in New York City. And upon graduating from school during World War I, he worked for the Wilson administration in a propaganda arm that was designed to create support for World War I, which at the time, at the outset of the war, was very unpopular in the United States. It was considered a European conflict. And of course, if you'll recall, there were a huge amount of Americans, still are, who had German ancestry. So the idea of going to war with Germany was not just an easy sell for the Wilson administration. So Edward Bernays was supposedly responsible for coining the phrase, "make the world safe for democracy," which we still heard, of course, redux throughout the Iraq War II in the Bush administration. So he's a very interesting guy. And later on, after the war, he became a very famous consultant for public relations. He became a great salesman, a great advertiser, and really went on to write the book. And I mean that quite literally. He wrote a book called Propaganda, for example. He really wrote the book on how to shape public opinion. And so I went out and read a couple of his books, which are pretty short and pretty easy reads, and got a much better sense of the man and what he was all about, and really came away, I hope, better understanding how the political class uses PC to shape the world and shape the culture in ways that we may not agree to, but yet they do without our permission.
So a lot of times when we're talking about PC, we're talking about this prevention of a very systemic, sexist, racist, and xenophobic society, and how we can prevent that by using the correct words and then watching what we say. What do you have to say about that?
Well, we hear that a lot, that PC is about kindness and respect and tolerance for others. And I don't entirely buy that. I don't think any of us need PC to help us be polite. In other words, hopefully our parents instilled us in that, or to help us have respect for others. I would see PC more as a culturally enforced sort of policeman. In other words, it's one thing not to use insulting language or to speak ill of other people or certain groups or minorities or women or gay, lesbian folks. But it's another thing to have an orthodoxy, permitted and non-permitted use of speech and language sort of shoved down our throats. And when I say shoved down our throats, we're not yet at the point in America, we certainly are in other countries, we're not yet at the point in America where you can generally be criminally charged with hate speech or locked up for writing a particular way or saying particular things. But we're certainly at a point where people's lives and careers and reputations and family life can be ruined by a slip up, an ill-placed tweet, or a Facebook post that someone makes in private and that gets back to their employer where they were railing about something that's not politically correct. So it's kind of a time where self-enforcement is more frightening than actual state enforcement. And the parallels here to the former Soviet Union, to Nazi Germany, are actually quite striking when you talk to people who are old enough to have been around in those times. This idea that you have to kind of watch what you say it's not an American sensation. It's not something that we ought to accept as Americans, in my view. It's something we ought to push back against. So I would distinguish between having respect and tolerating people or cultures or ideologies that are different than your own, and the orthodoxy, the enforced language that I believe PC represents.
So along those lines, we've seen a victimhood culture develop out of this. Can you talk about how that came about and how cultural Marxism and the victimhood culture are manifested in the present day?
Yeah, it's a tough situation because America has always had a lawsuit culture that was way ahead or way behind, depending on how you want to look at it. Other countries, we've always been more prone to go to court against one another. And I think that the victim culture sort of stems from that in many ways. And now we're seeing it particularly on college campuses where people are such special snowflakes, they're such tenderfeet that they can't sort of respond well to criticisms or even to commentary or opinions that don't comport with their own. So I would hate to think that a country that was really founded on its toughness, right? We think about America, we think about breaking away from England. We think about capturing the West. We think about the Old West, which was a tough, hard-boiled place. It was not really a place for the faint of heart because people had to literally sort of wrest a living from the land at one point in America. Well, we no longer have to do that. We have refrigerators full of food and laptops with basically the sum of human knowledge at our fingertips. And life is kind of easy from a material perspective. So I'm afraid that we're getting soft from a psychological or mental perspective as a result. And I think the victim culture is a sign of that. In other words, we shouldn't have to tolerate discomfort, even in the form of people or thoughts or language or opinions that make us uncomfortable. And that just the fact that someone's making us uncomfortable or challenging our beliefs is in and of itself an injustice that needs to be rectified. That's a dangerous attitude. It's also a demeaning attitude, and it's an embarrassing attitude. I mean, this is not an American approach to things. I think we ought to, we've always been a plain-spoken country, right? And I think there's some value in that.
Well, and something else that has gone along with, I guess, sort of the founding of America and then the progression of America in the decades and centuries forward has been sort of a rugged individualism. But we've seen more of a herd instinct replacing that individualism. How has that herd mentality and that movement towards the herd instinct and collectivism allowed PC to thrive in the present day?
Well, the herd instinct is real. It's instinctual, right? That's what instinct means, and it's hardwired into us. So it's nothing new. It's something that I think we've always fought against. There's always going to be a tension, I think, in any society between the desires of the individual and the greater good of everyone in that society. I think those tensions become exacerbated in more multicultural secular societies because you have less homogeneity among the population. So there's sort of less of a clannish or common culture, language, religion, background, ethnicity, etc., amongst the population. But I think there's sort of two kinds of collectivism or communitarianism we might consider. One is I would say a naturally occurring phenomenon. The other would be something that's more state imposed. So if we look at the history of, let's say, communist China or the communist revolution in the former Soviet Union, I would say those are unnatural communities. Those are forced on people against their will, and they require a very heavy hand of government and police and military and martial law to be maintained and enforced. So I think, communitarianism is good. I think it's healthy, it's natural, it's fine. I think the marketplace really represents that. But I think the kind of forced collectivism that we saw in the 20th century in some of the more tyrannical governments is not natural, not healthy. And, anything that needs to be enforced with guns is probably not something that the marketplace would choose absent those guns.
Political correctness is something that we've seen kind of universally on the right and on the left. Can you explain the differences between PC on the right versus PC on the left?
Well, there is PC on the right. It's identified today in modern American culture more with the left, but there is certainly PC on the right. I think when you see things like empty sloganeering, which I think support the troops sometimes represents, when you see the idea of soldiers boarding airplanes early, that sort of thing. I don't think that's wrong, but I think it's sort of a form of political correctness from the right. And certainly the right, like the left, likes to shade language to its advantage. In other words, whoever coined the term pro-life was obviously a messaging genius, right? Because instead of saying you're anti-abortion, you're pro-life. Who could be against life? So yes, the right shades language. The left, I think, is better. At least currently, the left is better. The left has had sort of, from my perspective, a century of success in a progressive agenda in the U.S. But more than anything, what the left has at its disposal is the education complex. Both public and private schools at all levels are dominated by people on the left. And I think that works its way into our culture in a million ways, and language being perhaps foremost amongst it. So, I think that you're right. PC works both ways, and we ought to be aware of it, and we ought to call out both sides if they try to force us down certain paths of approved thinking or approved speech.
Yeah, so can you expand on that notion of PC sort of infiltrating into language along with other aspects of Western culture? And can you talk a little bit about how language has changed from this PC onslaught?
Well, language absolutely has changed. And the question is sort of a chicken and the egg question. What comes first? Do we change our way of thinking so we speak differently, or do we speak differently and that subtly over time changes our way of thinking? I'm not sure I have an answer to that. I would really recommend to anyone another short book called Junk English. It's by a gentleman named Ken Smith, very brief, maybe 100 pages long. And he goes through a little bit of the history of using words in a way designed to obscure or obfuscate their real meaning. So, for example, he has a whole chapter devoted to war euphemisms, right? War is a nasty business, and certainly none of us want to know about or see the horrors or ravages of war. So we tend to use euphemisms in the theater of war. We tend to say things like police action. We tend to say things like making the world safe for democracy. We tend to say things like troops on the ground. In other words, we don't tend to use language like bomb and kill and maim and rob, right? It's just natural that we want to make things sort of sound better than they are. But when that becomes too widespread, and when it becomes an established practice by people in government, by media elites, then we have to really worry that we're being herded in a way that certainly George Orwell warned us against, right? A war is a war, and we ought to call it as such. And if some situation is so intolerable that the only avenue left to us, we believe, is warfare, so be it. But let's have the population and voters go into a war knowing what it is and calling it what it is, not a police action or anything else. So, we're not even really aware of it. There are a million ways that PC really works its way through our language. And I'll just give you one quick example is a lot of people think the innocuous term gay shouldn't be used, right? There's a whole older cohort who thinks that the term homosexual is the technically correct term for same-sex folks, and that if you even use gay to describe, gay and lesbians, that you're succumbing to PC just with that. So I don't go around using the term homosexual. I use the term gay. So I guess in a sense, just because of when I was born and the environment in which I live, I've accepted the term gay, which some people would say that is a shading of meaning and a shading of language.
Now, recently we've seen the rise of Donald Trump. How has the Trump phenomena affected political correctness?
Well, it's interesting. In some ways, it feels like, especially because of social media, and especially because of internet pushback, for example, anonymous comment sections on the internet, to a Washington Post or New York Times article, it almost feels like perhaps in the last year or two, we've reached peak PC in the West. Like the tide came in and it reached a high water mark, and now it's slowly receding, never to surpass that high water mark. It feels like that now. I'm not sure that that's true. Sometimes our perception based on the media we consume as individuals, the newspapers we read, the people we talk to, the friends we have, we get a very skewed perception of what the whole country is thinking or feeling. But it feels to me from the media I consume like we might have reached sort of peak PC, and that people are just fed up with being mealy-mouthed, and that the Trump phenomenon represents in some ways a culmination of this or a reflection of this. So it's going to be interesting. I think that Trump has not been afraid to be coarse. He's not been afraid to call things as he sees them from his perspective. So in that way, it's kind of a right-wing reaction to what the right sees as left-wing overreach, in the sense that, from the right's perspective, well, gee whiz, not everyone who opposes more immigration is a hateful, xenophobic bigot, and gee whiz, not everybody who is not thrilled about gay marriage is a vicious homophobe. Not everyone who's worried about Islamic terrorism is some kind of Christian bigot. It's a pushback. So I think Trump is a reflection of that. I wouldn't say he's driving it, but I certainly agree with you that he's a reflection of it.
All right. So something I want to turn back to that you mentioned briefly, but I'd like to get a little more into this, is PC on college campuses. We see safe spaces. We see students protesting speakers they don't agree with. We see a lot of shielding from alternative viewpoints. Just how, now Daniel and I have spent a lot of time on college campuses in recent years, so we have a sense, but for members of our audience who maybe haven't, can you explain just how bad PC is on college campuses and just how much PC is working to stifle academic freedom?
Well, it's a real problem, and I would distinguish between public and private universities, because at public universities they're taxpayer funded. I think each and every person in that state, each and every taxpayer in that state has an absolute interest in allowing or demanding that different viewpoints be heard and permitted on what is in effect taxpayer property, in a taxpayer hall or auditorium, on a taxpayer sound system. So at state universities, I think what's happening is really indefensible. The left does control college campuses. This is not a boogeyman of the right. This is a fact. If you look at college professors, a huge percentage of them, 90% plus, identify with the left. There's various theories as to why that's true, but nonetheless, it is true. And I think that also probably applies to most college administrators, and that filters down into a lot of suppression of conservative and libertarian thought. I think there's no question that's true. But I do think when you bring a speaker to a campus, I think people should be allowed to hold signs or protest or say you guy or gal is wrong, but that's different than trying to physically obstruct someone, trying to physically invade an event that a campus group went through all the hurdles and booked the room and did all the things that they're supposed to do. It's two different things. I don't believe in that speech ought to be chilled by physical confrontations, by physical disruptions of events. I find that pretty frightening. Now, as far as the professors themselves go, unlike academia of 30 years ago, we now do have a digital era. We have the internet. We have so many different means to communicate with each other that I think the average person now does have a voice and can speak their opinion and provide an alternative to mainstream academia in a way they couldn't 30 years ago. So I'm not as worried about PC on campus as it relates to older adults. But I do worry quite a bit that people at their most formative time in their lives are sort of just being shown one side of the coin, or maybe even less than one side of the coin. So it's a real problem. And with all deference to my friends on the left, this is not a right-wing hysteria. This is not something that the right wing is imagining. This is real. There is a real bias against conservatives on campus.
I want to bring up two quick examples of things, two different, symbols that have changed in meaning over, I would say, probably maybe the past 5 or 10 years. The Washington Redskins and their logo and the Confederate flag. Can you talk a little bit about those two things and how the ideas and the opinions on those two symbols have changed?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've studied the Redskins issue quite a bit, and what sometimes goes unspoken is that lots of Indians, which Native Americans actually prefer to be called Indians, don't mind the name. As a matter of fact, consider it much ado about nothing. But there is a vocal minority that cares about it. I was curious as to why Daniel Snyder, the team owner, wouldn't change the name proactively, perhaps a year or two ago before this thing blew up, so he could have been viewed as the good guy who got out in front of something and did something because it was for the best rather than because he's under intense pressure to do so. And I also thought he could have had a whole new merchandising campaign with jerseys and team apparel and all that with the new name. But now he's dug in his heels. And the league is in a very tough spot with respect to him. So look, I think there's a subset of American Indians who absolutely view the term Redskins like the N-word. So to that extent, I don't know why a business person, a business owner in the marketplace, Daniel Snyder, the Redskins owner, doesn't drop the name, and I think if public pressure grows to the point where he drops it, I think that's fine. I just hope he doesn't do it because of an edict. In other words, some members of Congress have been talking about holding hearings on the name and that sort of thing. So when you start to get government involved, maybe not passing a law, but just let's say the government just held hearings and issued a resolution, which the House of Representatives does all the time, just a resolution saying that the U.S. House disapproves of the Redskins' use of the name. That's where I think things start to get pretty heavy-handed, and I don't like that, and I don't agree with that. So that's very interesting, and we're going to see in 5 years whether the term Redskins still exists. If I had to bet today, I'd bet it doesn't in 5 years.
Okay, and how about recent reactions to the Confederate flag and the way political correctness has changed views of that symbol?
Yeah, well, that's really fascinating and horrifying from my perspective. There's been some monuments taken down in Texas. There's been some monuments at University of Texas. There have been some monuments to Confederate soldiers taken down in New Orleans. There's been some vandalism and graffiti and that sort of thing on Confederate memorials, Confederate cemeteries elsewhere. So this is something where I view this as dangerous. I view this as the whitewashing of history. The Confederacy represents a lot of things to a lot of people, some good, some bad, and it depends very, very much on your perspective, whether you're a Southerner, whether you're black, etc. So I don't think that the majority of Americans, or even the majority of African Americans, there I go using a PC term, not instead of black folks, calling them African Americans. I don't think a majority of anyone in America really wants to do this. I think this is white liberals who are obsessed with the Confederacy and Confederate flags. And look, the Confederacy existed. It happened. There were incredible Civil War battles. There were incredible Civil War soldiers. There were lots and lots of poor soldiers on both sides who fought. If you believe that the Civil War was primarily or completely about slavery, well, then there were an awful lot of poor white non-slave owners who died fighting the North. So it's it's a strange time when you see governments taking the Confederate flag down in the South. I don't think that's healthy. I think that makes me very uneasy. And in the state of Alabama, here where the Mises Institute is located, I've noticed that in the last year or so, Confederate flags have come down around the state capitol, which is near us, and also it used to be at rest stops on the interstate. So I think that is a tide that's turned, and I think that this will continue. I think that in another 5 or 10 years, you won't see a lot of highways still named Jefferson Davis and that sort of thing. I think that the PC enforcers are going to have their way on the Confederate flag, if you're asking my opinion.
Right. Well, and we've already seen it come down from the South Carolina State House.
Yes. Governor Nikki Haley was behind that, or at least in support of that. So, that's government action. And look, I understand the tension between the majority and the minority. If there's a minority in a state, let's say black people in South Carolina, who feel so strongly that the Confederate flag represents something truly evil, that it shouldn't fly around government or taxpayer-funded public property, so-called, and that the depth and degree and intensity of their feelings ought to trump the majority, right? I understand that argument. In many ways, that's the basis of the whole civil rights era argument, right? Because the majority of Americans, at least early on, opposed civil rights legislation. So I get that simple majoritarianism doesn't make right. But here I feel like something else is at play. I feel like there are actors and agents who just want to sort of browbeat Southerners and browbeat white conservatives. And that's what's really going on here, rather than black people themselves or descendants of slaves themselves driving this move to tear down everything Confederate.
So for those people who are opposed to this PC culture and the way it's degraded Western culture, what's the best thing those individuals can do to fight against it? Well,
like everything else, it starts at home. You have to control your own thoughts, control your own language, and educate your family, educate your friends about the dangers of PC, and sort of gently inform them when it's creeping into their own thoughts or words. And of course, one of the best ways to fight against the mainstream, what I would call mainstream PC culture, is to drop out of it, right? You don't have to watch CNN. You don't have to consume the Washington Post or the New York Times. There are plenty of ways to tailor your media or your information or your news sources or your social media to sources that you think are more honest or more plain spoken or un-PC. So, nobody's forcing us yet with a gun to say or think certain thoughts. So I think it really starts at home, and it really starts with pushback. Call people out on it, and let people know that just because most of the world wants to be herded along and just go along and get along, that you're not one of those people. If you're anti-PC, you have to have the courage of your convictions and push back.
Do you see the end of PC at some point in the future, or do you just see it growing? You were saying before how you think we reached peak PC, but do you see it going down farther, or do you think it'll just kind of level off?
Well, I think people who support PC, whether knowingly or just sort of by default, are definitely winning the day in America. Progressivism is on the march, and what we might call old-fashioned conservatism is on the decline. That has a lot of elements. It goes to the demographic changes in our country. It goes to the number of people who are now secular in our country versus religious 50 years ago. But so some of those changes are inexorable. I have a feeling, however, that the minority of people who are un-PC and anti-PC are going to become louder and more vociferous, and they're going to use especially social media to always be calling the mainstream media when they use PC. I mean, there's never been a time when the mainstream media had as much pushback as it does today. And if academia is where PC is planted, I would say mainstream media is where it's watered and grows to its full height. So it's I think the anti-PC crowd will be a shrinking minority, but a louder and more vociferous and maybe ultimately more powerful minority than today.
All right. Well, on that note, I want to thank you for joining us. And before we conclude, can you talk a little bit about where our listeners can follow your work? And also, can you talk about the Mises Institute a little bit for those in our audience who are unfamiliar with that organization?
Sure. The Mises Institute is an economics educational think tank. We started out on the Auburn University campus in the 1980s. 30 years later, we're now independent, have our own building in Auburn. So we exist primarily to promote Austrian economics, which is an entire wing of economic thought that is mostly at odds with the Keynesian school of thought that more or less dominates today. You can find out more at Mises.org, Mises.org, and you can follow me through Mises.org or through Twitter at Jeff Deist is my Twitter name.
Well, great. And I just want to remind all of our listeners that wakeupcallpodcast.com/PC is the show notes page for this episode. So we'll link to all the resources you just mentioned. We'll link to Junk English and some of the books you've mentioned over the course of the interview. And the whole reason that I had the idea to have you on for this to discuss this topic was because of a talk that you gave in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. So we'll link to that talk as well, called PC is Control, Not Etiquette. So on that note, thank you once again for joining us, and hopefully we can talk to you again in the future.
All right. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes, or subscribe on Stitcher, and check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.